The Unsurrendered People by Kenzaburo Oe. Kenzaburo Oe of 1935, an essayist, novelist, and short story writer, was born in Shikoku, Japan. The Hiroshima bombing by American forces in 1945 occurred when Oe was only 6. When he was 18, he enrolled at Tokyo University to study French literature. He started writing as a student and won the Okutagawa Award for his short story The Catch. He became a celebrity writer with his novels Nip the Buds and Shoot the Kids in 1958 and The Youth Who Came Late of 1961. He married Yukari, who was the daughter of the well-known director and the screenwriter Mansaku Itaki. Their first child, Hikari, was born with brain damage, and his disability became a significant influence in Oe's work. In later years, his writings featured two dominant aspects of his life. Firstly, his incapacitated child, who went on to become a famous music composer, and secondly, a world of his own, created out of myths, history, literature, and cultural anthropology. The former gave rise to the novel Letters to My Sweet Bygone Years in 1987, and the latter to the novels M.O.T. and the Wonders of the Forest in 1986, The Flaming Green, Until the Savior Gets Socked in 1993, Vacillating in 1994, and On the Great Day in 1995. Oe also explores the traditional trope of mythical Japan, trying to unravel its identity in the post-war modern culture. His range of despair and discomfort shackles the post-war Japan by holding a mirror in the face of its grim reality. Through the intertwined threads of tragedy and comedy, Oe explores human predicaments in the wake of ongoing developments in the nuclear technology. Oe was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1994. He is a major figure in contemporary Japanese literature, and his writings engage with issues like nuclear weapon, social nonconformism, and existentialism. The current reading is from Hiroshima Notes, where he tries to decipher how the bombing survivors faced the dehumanizing cataclysm with courage and resolve. His tone is both affirmative of the people's determination to rebuild their lives and the city, and critical of the minds that influenced this catastrophe on them. The bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, killed 140,000 people and left thousands crippled, traumatized, and an entire generation born with debilitating defects caused by radioactivity. Oe experienced Hiroshima for himself when he heard about it as a child in his village in Shikoku in 1945, and then through his interviews with survivors during 1963 and 1965. He remains a staunch advocate of democracy and anti-nuclear activism. Certainly, it's no longer fashionable to do so. But all of a sudden, one summer, an absolute evil intruded into the lives and consciousness of the A-bomb victims. To counter that absolute evil, it became necessary to have an absolute good in order to recover a human balance in the world and to persevere in resisting that evil. From that instant the atomic bomb exploded, it became the symbol of all human evil. It was a savagely primitive demon and a most modern curse. The attempt to accord it positive value as a means of ending the war quickly did not, however, bring peace even to the minds of all the airmen who carried out the atomic attack. The atomic bomb embodied the absolute evil of war, transcending lesser distinctions such as Japanese or allies, attacker or attacked. Even while the smoke still rose from the wasteland of total destruction, human goodwill began to go into action as people made their first moves towards recovery and restoration. This action was seen both in the injured victims' will to live and in the efforts of the doctors who worked in a virtual vacuum of supplies and support systems to treat the victims. Initiated soon that summer morning by the people in Hiroshima, the acts of goodwill were essential to resisting that ultimate thrust of accumulated science which produced the atomic bomb. If one believes that there is some kind of human harmony or order in this world, then he must also believe that the efforts of the Hiroshima doctors were somehow sufficient to cope with the demonic aftermath of the atomic disaster. For my part, I have a kind of nightmare about trusting in human strength or in humanism. It is a nightmare about a particular kind of trust in human capability. Toward this kind of humanism, and it is nothing more than a kind of humanism, I have a strong antipathy. So much so that I cannot help thinking about it from time to time. My nightmares stems from a suspicion that a certain trust in human strength or humanism flashed across the minds of the American intellectuals who decided upon the project that concluded with the dropping of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. That humanism ran as follows. If this absolutely lethal bomb is dropped on Hiroshima, a scientifically predictable hell will result. But the hell will not be so thoroughly disastrous as to wipe out once and for all that is good in human society. That hell will not be so completely beyond the possibility of human recovery that all mankind will despise their humanity merely at the thought of it. It will not be an unrelieved hell with no exit, or so devastatingly evil that President Truman will, throughout his life, be unable to sleep for thinking of it. There are, after all, people in Hiroshima who will make the hell as humane as they possibly can. I suspect that the A-bomb planners thought it such a way that in making the final decision they trusted too much in the enemy's own human strength to cope with the hell that would follow the dropping of the atomic bomb. If so, theirs was a most paradoxical humanism. Suppose the atomic bomb had been dropped, say on Leopoldville in Congo, instead of on Hiroshima, initially a huge number of people would have died instantly. Then wounded survivors forced to accept total surrender would have continued to die many months to come. Epidemics would have spread and pests would have proliferated in the desolate ruins. The city would have become a wasteland where human beings perished without seas or succor. There would have been no one to dispose of the dead, and when the victor would come in to investigate the damage, they would have experienced the worst nausea ever. Some of them would never be sane, normal persons again. One whole city would have been rendered as deadly as a huge death chamber in a Nazi concentration camp. All the people would have been doomed to death, with no sign of hope to be found. Such a scenario is shocking to even the toughest mind. Unless some slave driver's descendant had been available to make the decision, the dropping of an atomic bomb in Leopoldville would have been postponed without setting a future date. What actually happened in Hiroshima when the atomic bomb was in fact dropped was not quite as horrible as the preceding scenario. For one thing, the people who survived in Hiroshima made no particular effort to impress on those who dropped the bomb what a dreadful thing they had done. Even though the city was utterly devastated and had become a vast, ugly death chamber, the Hiroshima survivors first began struggling to recover and rebuild. They did so, of course, for their own sakes. But doing so served also to lessen the burden on the conscience of those who had dropped the atomic bomb. The recovery effort has continued for 2 decades and continues even now. The fact that a girl with leukemia goes on suffering all her life, not committing suicide, surely lessens, by just one person's portion, the A-bomb dropper's burden of conscience. It is quite abnormal that people in one city should decide to drop an atomic bomb on people in another city. The scientists involved cannot possibly have lacked the ability to imagine the hell that would issue from the explosion. The decision, nevertheless, was made. I presume that it was done on the basis of some calculations of a built-in harmony by virtue of which, if the incredibly destructive bomb were dropped, the greatest effort in history would be to counterbalance the totality of the enormous evil to follow. The inhumane damage caused by this demonic weapon would be mitigated by the humane efforts of those struggling to find what hope they could in the desperate situation. The notion of balancing also reflects a confidence in human strength, itself a reflection of confidence in the strength of humanism. But it is the attacking wolf's confidence in the scapegoat's ability to set things straight after the pitiless damage is done. This is the gruesome nightmare I have about humanism. Perhaps it is no more than an over-anxious delusion of mine. I think of the patients of the A-bomb victims quietly awaiting their turns in the waiting room of the atomic bomb casualty commission on the top of Hijiyama Hill. At least it is true that their stoicism greatly reduces the emotional burden of the American doctors working there. I have little knowledge of the Bible. It seems to me, though, that when God made the rain fall for 40 days and nights, he fully trusted that Noah would rebuild human society after the great flood ended. If Noah had been a lazy man or a hysterical man given to despair, then there would have been great consternations in God's heaven. Fortunately, Noah had the needed will and ability, so the deluge played its part within God's plan for man, without staying the tyrant beyond God's expectations. Did God, too, count on a built-in harmony of balancing out? And if so, does God not seem rather vicious? The atomic destruction of Hiroshima was the worst deluge of the 20th century. The people of Hiroshima went to work at once to restore human society in the aftermath of this great atomic flood. They were concerned to salvage their own lives, but in the process, they also salvaged the souls of the people who had brought the atomic bomb. This great flood of the present age is a kind of universal deluge which, instead of receding, has become frozen, and we cannot foretell when it will thaw and flow away. To change the metaphor, the 20th century has become afflicted with a cancer, the possession of a nuclear weapon by various nations, for which there is no known cure. And the souls salvaged by the people of Hiroshima are the souls of all human beings alive today.
The Old Prison, Judith Wright. Judith Wright is one of Australia's most celebrated poets. She spent her childhood at Wallamumbai, her family's sheep ranch in New South Wales. She studied at the University of Sydney, from where she went on to travel through Europe with friends. On returning to Australia, she bonded again with the land of her childhood days and found in the land her muse. Working as a statistician at the University of Queensland in Brisbane in the 1940s, she published her poems in literary magazines. The Moving Image, 1946, was her first published poetry collection. She later married Jack McKinney, a philosophy writer. She continued to write stories and poems for their daughter Meredith. Expanding the horizons of her political involvement, she lent her voice for upholding the rights of Aboriginal Australians and to the cause of the environment, both of which are major themes in her poetry. Her second collection of poems, Woman to Man, 1949, is a celebration of womanhood. The Gateway, 1953, and Birds, 1962, are two notable works from the 60s. Other poetry collections are The other half, 1966, Collected Poems, 1942 to 1970, Alive Poems, 1971 to 1972, Fourth Quarter and Other Poems, 1976, and Phantom Dwelling, 1985. She wrote profusely, attempting other genres like short stories, non-fiction, fictional biography, and criticism. The Judith Wright Prize is awarded annually for a book of poems published the previous year by an Australian author. The poem, The Old Prison, is about the convict built jail at Trial Bay near Kempsey. In 1816, the ship Trial wrecked near the eponymous bay due to a mutiny among the convicts aboard it for the bounty on board the ship. In 1879, work began on the construction of a gaol for the purposes of using prison labor in the bay. The jail was abandoned in 1903. Later, over 500 German prisoners of First World War were held there, but the building was closed again in 1922. Time and the ravages of war have taken their toll, and today the jail is in ruins. On a visit to the site, the poet is affected by the sight of the disintegrated building. She contemplates the sadness of the prisoners who were once housed there. The remains of the building seem to foreground the desolation and despondency felt by the prisoners during their isolated, melancholic existence far from their homelands. The havoc wreaked upon the prison walls by the merciless weather and concerted efforts of the wind and the ocean makes the poet think that what befell the jail was the culmination of the rancor and malice that the greed of the mutinies and the grief of the forlorn war prisoners brought. This theme is sustained by the use of strong imagery. The old prison. The rows of cells are unroofed, a flute for the wind's mouth, who comes with a breath of ice from the blue caves of the south. O dark and fierce day, the wind like an angry bee hunts for the black honey in the pits of the hollow sea. Waves of shadow wash the empty shell born bare, and like a bone it sings a bitter song of air. Who built and labored here, the wind and the sea say, their cold nest is broken and they are blown away. They did not breed nor love, each in his cell alone, cried as the wind now cries through this flute of stone.
War, Luigi Pirandello. Luigi Pirandello, 1867 to 1936, was born in Sicily to a wealthy family of sulfur miners. He earned his doctorate in Roman philology in 1891. He married Antonietta Portolano, the daughter of a sulfur merchant. A drastic turn for the worse in the family fortunes in 1903, Antonietta's increasing psychological difficulties, her institutionalization in 1919, and the capture of both their sons in a First World War military campaign weighed heavily on the household. Pirandello had begun writing while at university and returned to Rome to pursue a career as an author. To support himself and his family, he also began to teach rhetoric and Italian literature at various local colleges. The tremendous volume of work written by him exposes his sensitivity to the monotony of a disillusioned life in search of a personality. He translated Goethe's Roman elegies, wrote his Elegy Renee, 2 books of poetry, and a volume of short stories entitled Amore Senza Amore in 1894. Pirandello's first novel, La Sclusa, appeared in 1901. Il fu Mattia Pascal, his first major success, followed in 1904. His novellas have been collected under the title Novella per an anno, published in 15 volumes. He was given the Nobel Prize in 1934. The story War by Luigi Pirandello was written in response to the First World War. The story takes place on a train in Italy during the First World War. A group of elderly passengers are traveling on the night express. What starts off as a simple exchange quickly escalates into morbid one-upmanship, with each passenger trying to best the other's pain and bitterness at losing their sons to the war. While everyone is wallowing in self-pity, a man suggests that accepting the fact of their son's conscriptions, deaths, and injuries is better than crying over their irreversible fates. This seems to calm everyone down until a grieving mother, thus far silent and remote, innocuously asks him if his son was really dead. This simple-minded question shakes a man's fragile equanimity, and he breaks down uncontrollably into tears. Pirandello's story is a study of the possibility of stoic denial in the face of deep personal suffering and public duty, and how an epiphany, a sudden realization of unshakable truth, can alter human convictions. It's a touching story about the effect of war on the lives of ordinary people who struggle to carry on, enduring the human course of war and the death of a loved one as best as they can. The story War. The passengers who had left Rome by the night express had to stop until dawn at the small station of Fabriano in order to continue their journey by the small, old-fashioned local joining the main line with Sulmona. At dawn, in a stuffy and smoky second-class carriage in which 5 people had already spent the night, a bulky woman in deep mourning was hoisted in, almost like a shapeless bundle. Behind her, puffing and mourning, followed her husband, a tiny man, thin and weakly, his face death white, his eyes small and bright, and looking shy and uneasy. Having at last taken a seat, he politely thanked the passengers who had helped his wife and who had made room for her. Then he turned round to the woman trying to pull down the collar of her coat and politely inquired, "Are you all right, dear?" The wife, instead of answering, pulled up her collar again to her eyes so as to hide her face. "Nasty world," muttered the husband with a sad smile. And he felt it his duty to explain to his travelling companions that the poor woman was to be pitied, for the war was taking away from her her only son, a boy of 20, to whom both had devoted their entire life, even breaking up their home at Sulmona to follow him to Rome, where he had to go as a student, then allowing him to volunteer for war, with an assurance, however, that at least 6 months he would not be sent to the front, and now, all of a sudden, receiving a wire saying that he was due to leave in 3 days' time and asking them to go and see him off. The woman under the big coat was twisting and wriggling, at times growling like a wild animal, feeling certain that all those explanations would not have aroused even a shadow of sympathy from those people who, most likely, were in the same plight as herself. One of them, who had been listening with particular attention, said, "You should thank God that your son is only leaving now for the front. Mine has been sent there the first day of the war. He has already come back twice wounded and been sent back again to the front." "What about me? I have 2 sons and 3 nephews at the front," said another passenger. "Maybe, but in our case it's our only son," ventured the husband. "What difference can it make? You may spoil your only son by excessive attentions, but you cannot love him more than you would all your other children if you had any. Parental love is not like bread that can be broken to pieces and split among us the children in equal shares. A father gives all his love to each one of his children without discrimination, whether it be 1 or 10. And if I am suffering now for my 2 sons, I am not suffering half for each of them, but double." True, true, sighed the embarrassed husband. But suppose, of course, we all hope it'll never be your case. A father has two sons at the front and he loses one of them, there is still one left to console him, while. Yes, answered the other, getting cross. A son left to console him, but also a son left for whom he must survive. While in the case of the father of an only son, if the son dies, the father can die too and put an end to his distress. Which of the two positions is worse? Don't you see how my case would be worse than yours? Nonsense, interrupted another traveller, a fat, red faced man with bloodshot eyes of the palest grey. He was panting. From his bulging eyes seemed to spurt inner violence of an uncontrolled vitality, which his weakened body could hardly contain. Nonsense, he repeated, trying to cover his mouth with his hand so as to hide the two missing front teeth. Nonsense. Do we give life to our own children for our own benefit? The other travellers stared at him in distress. The one who had had his son at the front since the first day of the war sighed. You are right. Our children do not belong to us. They belong to the country. Bosh! Retorted the fat traveller. Do we think of the country when we give life to our children? Our sons are born because? Well, because they must be born. And when they come to life, they take our own life with them. This is the truth. We belong to them, but they never belong to us. And when they reach 20, they are exactly what we were at their age. We too had a father and mother, but there were so many other things as well: girls, cigarettes, illusions, new ties, and the country, of course, whose call we would have answered when we were 20, even if father and mother had said no. Now, at our age, the love for country is still great, of course, but stronger than it is the love of our children. Is there any one of us here who wouldn't gladly take his son's place at the front if he could? There was a silence all round, everybody nodding as to approve. Why then, continued the fat man, should we consider the feelings of our children when they are 20? Isn't it natural that at their age they should consider the love for their country? I'm speaking of decent boys, of course, even greater than the love for us. Isn't it natural that it should be so, as after all they must look upon us as upon all boys who cannot move any more and must sit at home? Isn't it natural that at their age they should consider the love for their country? I'm speaking of decent boys, of course, even greater than the love for us. Isn't it natural that it should be so, as, after all, they must look upon us as upon all boys who cannot move any more and must sit at home? If country is a natural necessity like bread, of which each of us must eat in order not to die of hunger, somebody must go to defend it. And our sons go when they are 20. And they don't want tears, because if they die inflamed and happy. I'm speaking, of course, of decent boys. Now, if one dies young and happy, without having the ugly sides of life, the boredom of it, the pettiness, the bitterness of disillusion, what more can we ask for him? Everyone should stop crying. Everyone should laugh as I do, or at least thank God as I do, because my son, before dying, sent me a message saying that he was dying satisfied and having ended his life in the best way he could have wished. That's why, as you see, I don't even wear mourning. He shook his light fawn coat as to show it. His livid lip over his missing teeth was trembling. His eyes were watery and motionless, and soon after he ended with a shrill laugh which might well have been a sob. Quite so, agreed the others. The woman, who, bundled in a corner under her cot, had been sitting and listening, had for the last 3 months tried to find in the words of her husband and her friends something to console her in her deep sorrow, something that might show her how a mother should resign herself to send her son not even to death, but to a probable danger of life. Yet, not a word had she found amongst the many that had been said, and her grief had been greater in seeing that nobody, as she thought, could share her feelings. But now, the words of the traveller amazed and almost stunned her. She suddenly realized that it wasn't the others who were wrong and could not understand her, but herself who could not rise up to the same height of those fathers and mothers willing to resign themselves without crying not only to the departure of their sons but even to their death. She lifted her head. She bent over from a corner, trying to listen with great attention to the details which the fat man was giving to his companions about the way his son had fallen as a hero for his king and his country, happy and without regrets. It seemed to her that she had stumbled into a world she had never dreamt of, a world so far unknown to her, and she was so pleased to hear everyone joining in congratulating that brave father who could so stoically speak of his child's death. Then suddenly, just as if she had heard nothing of what had been said, and almost as if waking up from a dream, she turned to the old man, asking him, "Then is your son really dead?" Everyone stared at her. The old man, too, turned to look at her, fixing his great, bulging, horribly watery light grey eyes deep in her face. For some time he tried to answer, but words failed him. He looked and looked at her, almost as if only then, at that silly, incongruous question, he had suddenly realized at last that his son was really dead. Gone forever, forever. His face contracted, became horribly distorted. Then he snatched in haste a handkerchief from his pocket and, to the amazement of everyone, broke into harrowing, heartbreaking, uncontrollable sobs.